Chapter 16. The Identity of Consistency. Identity is often treated as something discovered. People speak as though they have a fixed nature and their task is to uncover it, to find the version of themselves that is most authentic, most aligned, most real. In practice, identity is usually constructed. It is assembled quietly through repetition, through the evidence a person accumulates about what they do when conditions are ordinary, when motivation is absent, when the day is imperfect. The mind does not form identity from ideals. It forms identity from patterns. Consistency is not merely a trait, it is a producer of self-belief. A person who returns to the work repeatedly begins to see themselves differently, not because they affirm anything, but because they have proof. Proof is what the mind trusts. It trusts what happens, not what is promised. When a person says they will act and then acts, the mind registers this as information. When a person says they will act and does not, the mind also registers that. Over time, these registrations become a private story about who a person is, and that story influences what feels possible long before any conscious decision is made. This is why inconsistency often feels heavier than failure. Failure can occur within a consistent pattern. A person can try, miss, adjust, and continue. Inconsistency is different. It is a pattern of broken contact. It teaches the mind that intention is unreliable. The person may still have strong ambitions and clear values, yet they begin to experience themselves as someone who cannot be counted on. This erosion is subtle. It rarely appears as a single thought. It appears as hesitation before beginning, as a quiet cynicism toward one's own plans, as a reflexive assumption that discipline will not last. The mind learns to stop believing you when you stop proving yourself. This is not moral judgment, it is adaptation. The system reduces disappointment by lowering expectation. If it has observed that effort comes in bursts and then disappears, it stops investing in long plans. It stops trusting the future version of you. The present version then finds it harder to begin because beginning feels futile. The identity has already formed. This is what happens. I start and then stop. Consistency interrupts this identity formation by producing a different kind of evidence. The evidence does not have to be dramatic. In fact, it is more persuasive when it is ordinary. A person does not need to overhaul their life to reshape self-belief. They need to repeat a small commitment long enough for the mind to stop treating it as a temporary mood. Repetition creates a track. Once the track exists, the mind begins using it automatically. What was once effort becomes default, not because it became easy, but because it became familiar. Familiarity is one of the most underestimated forces in human behavior. People imagine that change requires high emotion. They imagine they must feel inspired, must want it intensely, must hit a turning point. Inspiration can initiate movement, but it rarely sustains it. Sustenance comes from the gradual conversion of deliberate actions into familiar actions. Familiar actions do not require persuasion every time. They require only return. The act becomes something you simply do, like locking the door behind you or brushing your teeth. The emotional drama is removed, and with it, the constant negotiation. Negotiation is where identity is often lost. When a person negotiates with themselves daily, they experience themselves as divided. One part wants progress, another wants relief. One part wants the long-term result, another wants to avoid discomfort now. This division is not a pathology, it is simply a mind with competing impulses. The problem is not the impulses, the problem is the habit of reopening the question each time. Each negotiation suggests that the decision is not settled. Each negotiation makes the behavior feel optional. Optional behaviors require mood support. Mood support is inconsistent. Consistency is the decision made once and honored many times. This is what gives it its identity-shaping power. A person who repeats a deliberate action is not merely accumulating output, they are accumulating a sense of being the kind of person who follows through. This sense is quiet at first. It may not feel like confidence. It can feel like nothing. Yet the mind begins registering a new pattern. When this action is due, it happens. the person's self-image shifts accordingly. The shift is often noticeable in how the person begins to approach friction. Inconsistent people tend to treat friction as a verdict. If something feels difficult, they interpret difficulty as a sign that something is wrong. They conclude they are tired, that they are not built for this, that the timing is off. These conclusions are not always conscious, but they operate as permissions to disengage. Consistent people treat friction differently, not because they like it, but because they are no longer surprised by it. Friction becomes part of the expected landscape. The presence of friction no longer threatens identity, because identity is no longer built on ease, it is built on return. Return changes the mind's relationship with discomfort. Discomfort becomes less personal. It becomes a known companion rather than a warning sign. The person stops asking whether they are in the right state and begins asking what the next contact is. This change is crucial because many identities are built around avoiding discomfort. People see themselves as someone who needs to feel good to work well, needs clarity to begin, needs motivation to persist. These identities are not innate. They are the result of repeated obedience to internal weather. Consistency breaks the weather's authority by repeating action through varied conditions. The conditions do not need to be extreme. They only need to be different enough for the mind to learn that action is not dependent on a particular mood. This is how a steady mind is trained without any attempt at suppression. Emotion is allowed to be present, action continues anyway. Over time, the mind stops treating emotion as the gatekeeper because it has observed that the gate is not real. The person can pass through, the work can be done. This is where consistency becomes identity rather than behavior. A person who has practiced return begins to feel a quiet certainty, not the theatrical certainty of believing outcomes will be perfect, but the grounded certainty of knowing they will show up. This certainty changes planning. The person makes commitments differently because they believe themselves more. They set sequences rather than fantasies. They stop building their future on the assumption that a better mood will arrive. They build on the assumption that they can act under ordinary conditions. Ordinary conditions are the true test because ordinary conditions are most of life. People who are inconsistent often still perform well under crisis because crisis creates intensity. Intensity reduces choice. It forces focus. It provides adrenaline. Many people call this their best self. In reality, it is their emergency self. It is useful, sometimes impressive, but it cannot be the foundation of a stable life. Stability requires the ability to function without emergency fuel. It requires the ability to move forward when there is no dramatic threat and no dramatic excitement. Consistency is the skill that makes progress possible without spectacle. The mind, however, tends to resist spectacle-free progress because it does not feel like transformation. The person may return day after day and still feel as though nothing has changed, because the mind expects change to arrive as a feeling. Yet identity changes often occur without feeling. They occur the way calluses form, gradually, through contact, until one day the person notices that what used to hurt no longer does, and what used to feel impossible now feels like a normal demand. This is not motivational, it is mechanical. The system adapts to what is repeated. It adapts neurologically, behaviorally, emotionally. Repetition teaches attention where to go. It teaches the body what to tolerate. It teaches the mind what to expect. If a person repeats avoidance, the mind expects avoidance and prepares for it. If a person repeats return, the mind recounts return and prepares for it. Preparation shapes behavior. Behavior shapes evidence. Evidence shapes identity. This is the loop that consistency uses to reshape a person. It is not a loop of belief leading to action. It is action leading to belief. A person does not become consistent because they believe in themselves. They begin to believe in themselves because they have been consistent long enough to create proof. Proof is the only lasting antidote to self-doubt, because self-doubt is often not an opinion, it is the mind's memory of broken follow-through. Consistency rewrites that memory by replacing it with a new pattern. This also changes how a person experiences ambition. Ambition becomes less anxious. It becomes less dependent on mood spikes and turning points. The person stops needing to feel a surge to feel committed. Commitment becomes quieter. It looks like returning. It looks like continuing when nobody is watching. It looks like doing the same small act again, not because it is thrilling, but because it is the act that moves reality. As this becomes normal, identity begins to consolidate. The person feels less divided, not because conflict disappears, but because conflict is no longer negotiated endlessly. The mind still produces impulses to avoid, to delay, to seek relief. These impulses are allowed, but they are not treated as decisions. The decision has been made already, in the form of a repeated pattern. The person returns to the work with less drama, because the return no longer requires persuasion. They may still have bad days, they may still miss. What changes is what those misses mean. In an inconsistent identity, a miss becomes proof. It becomes confirmation that the person cannot be counted on. In a consistent identity, a miss becomes an event. It is noticed, corrected, and folded back into the pattern. The identity holds because it is built on more than a single day. It is built on accumulated repetition. This is one of the quiet benefits of consistency. It gives a person a wider time horizon in which to interpret themselves. The self becomes less fragile when it is built on continuity. Fragility in identity often shows up as overreaction to small setbacks. A person slips once and concludes they are back where they started. They interpret the slip as a revelation. The interpretation creates discouragement, discouragement creates disengagement, and disengagement becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Consistency prevents this escalation by providing counter-evidence. The person can say, without forced positivity, this was a deviation, not a definition. Definition is what repetition creates. The identity of consistency is not a label you adopt. It is a shape that forms around your behavior. Over time, others notice it, but more importantly, you notice it in yourself. The mind begins to treat your intentions as credible. Planning becomes less fantastical because you no longer require fantasy fuel to act. You begin relying on the simplest resource available, your ability to return. This is why consistency changes not only output, but personality. Not personality as temperament, but personality as a pattern of behavior under pressure, under fatigue, under uncertainty. A person who returns becomes steadier in conversation, steadier in conflict, steadier in decision-making. They become less volatile not because they have numbed themselves, but because their identity is no longer built on the need to resolve every feeling immediately. They know they can keep going. They know they can come back. The need for dramatic emotional reinforcement fades. What replaces it is a quieter confidence, one that does not require a particular mood to sustain. That confidence is not optimism, it is familiarity with oneself in action. It is the mind recognizing through repeated proof that you are someone who does what you said you would do, not perfectly, not theatrically, but reliably. And reliability, once internalized, stops being something you try to be and becomes something you simply are, because the evidence has been accumulated and the identity has settled around it.